Chapter 3. Irene survives the crash.
As they loaded me into the MASH-type helicopter that took me to the emergency trauma center after the accident, I felt how much easier it would be for me to just let go and die. But then I remembered the messages I'd gotten and knew I had to live. I connected with the medical team working on me, asking their names and even thanking them for their help. Their compassion was an additional inspiration to live the directive I'd just been given about being loving and kind to everyone. That night in the emergency room, I appreciated every person who came near me as if there were rows of angels watching me, including the empathetic doctor whose job it was to give me the official news that Saul was gone. It makes sense to me now why heaven had asked me to be loving and kind to everyone. That way, I consciously stayed open to all the love and support being sent to me through others. The doctor who told me the news about Saul promised to be there with me when I had to tell the kids their father was gone. Dr. Jordan was a tailor-made gift from the angels. There I was, being treated in a Catholic hospital, yet heaven managed to bring me a surgeon to comfort me who also served as the assistant rabbi in his synagogue. I told the kids one by one. They poured their grief and sadness into calling friends, family, and business associates, and attending to the details of the funeral arrangements. Sandy, Bruce, and Matt worked as a great team during those first horrific hours and days after losing Saul. As I've always believed that family is so much more about love than blood ties, it was incredibly reassuring and rewarding to see my blended family cooperate so lovingly with one another. In the midst of this tragedy, I saw how all those hours in counseling and all those nights Saul and I had worried over and cared for these 3 kids now came back tenfold. 3 days later, I left the hospital to begin my new life without Saul. About 6 weeks after the accident, I felt like I was living in hell. I'd participated in Saul's funeral. I'd survived Shiva. I had begun negotiations over a ton of delicate family issues, and I was struggling to cope with the demands of a complicated real estate development business. I cried myself to sleep at the end of every long, problem-filled day. Despite the love and help of friends and family, I still felt totally alone. Then one day, I got a condolence call that started me down a whole new path. It was from my dry cleaner, Joel. Several years ago, after tragically losing a son, he'd been counseled by his grief therapist to try contacting his son on the other side. He told me how positive his experience had been. It had helped him heal and go on. He recommended I see a medium named John Edward because of the unique, humorous, and very touching way he had of helping people commune with the souls of loved ones who'd crossed over. I hadn't believed in any of this stuff before Saul died, but having received those incredible messages, I knew there was a bigger reason for my having survived the accident. Those messages had intensified a feeling I'd had since I was a kid, that I had some specific destiny to fulfill. Experiencing those words before and during Saul's death had broken down my skepticism, so I decided, what the hell? Why not give this Edward guy a shot? I was missing Saul with every fiber in my body. Anything was worth a try. 2 weeks later, I went with Joel and his wife to an event hosted by John Edward. There were about 35 people there. I sat amazed as this man reeled off incredibly personal details from the deceased to their loved ones in the room. Soon, it was my turn. He says he sees you're driving his favorite car with Saul Z on the license plate, and that you're wearing his skier charm under your blouse. I was astounded. How in God's name could this man, or anyone else for that matter, know what I was wearing under my blouse? He's telling me the accident took place in a different state from where you live, he went on. He's telling me 3 hours passed between the accident and the time you were officially told he was dead. This was when I really began to know it was Saul, and somehow, in some way, he was communicating with me from wherever he was. These details about the accident were private to me and Saul, specific pieces of information, and they were true. I'm getting a feeling of a heart attack and of hemorrhaging around the heart. Is that how he died? John Edward asked. It was. Something had penetrated Saul's skull, causing a chain reaction of internal hemorrhaging in the chest cavity that led to the heart attack that was the medical cause of his death. Joel busily wrote down the messages for me as I reacted with a mix of tears, surprise, and elation. The rush of this communion with Saul convinced me that all I'd ever been taught by my Jewish faith was true. We do go on. Our souls are eternal. My experience with John Edward went from interesting to wild beyond belief when he captured the essence of my ribald, loving Saul. Was he a real character? John asked. Did he like to tell jokes with accents? And did he own a lot of hats? The answers to all these questions was yes. He's holding up a can of tomato juice. He says it's about a joke between the two of you. It was. When my son Matt was small, Saul liked to joke that he was so skinny, if you filled him with tomato juice, he'd look just like a thermometer. Now this was my Saulie. He's holding up 2 fingers on one hand and one on the other, John continued. Does this have a meaning for you? It sure did. Saul and I had raised 3 kids together, his 2 and my 1. That simple image summed up what had been the core of our marriage, creating a loving home for our blended family. He's telling me he knows you had a premonition that he was going to die in the accident. This blew me away. I had told no one, not even Saul, that I had been given this information prior to the accident. Of all the details and pieces I got that evening, this was the one that really knocked me out. I mean, someone might have the psychic ability to read a person's mind or make educated guesses about how human grief works, but that spiritual premonition had been my secret. No one on earth knew anything about it. For the first time since the accident, I actually smiled. I was still grieving, but after this experience, the desire to hear from Saul again gave me something more hopeful to think about, including lots of questions that started popping up inside me. What would happen to Saul's and my love now that I knew there was life after death? Were we soulmates? I'd always felt our love was bigger and stronger than most. Now I was coming to believe we must have loved and lost each other before. I started devouring books on spirituality, looking for anything that might echo what I was experiencing or give me some answers. My session with John Edward opened me up some to new possibilities, but I'm a logical, structured person. I needed to be reassured with supporting information. I attended classes about communicating with the spirit world, and through one of those teachers, I got another message that turned my world even further upside down. This message told me, though I have no degree in literature, and no history of being any kind of public personality, to write a book about Saul and me. This book, the message said, was to center around our love for each other, a love that had spanned centuries. It was also supposed to be about how living love as a behavior toward oneself and others, as Saul and I had worked so hard to do, is the key lesson we all need to learn while we're here on earth. I was at a total loss. I had no idea where to begin. So why did I take this leap of faith and begin writing this book? To tell you the truth, it was because I'd found Saul again. When he had been alive, I had devoted my life to helping him, and through these conversations with him, I knew that Saul needed me to do something for him now. Whether it was because I still loved him so much, or because I was still in the habit of doing things for him, I knew I could not turn my back on him, so I took the leap. Not long into the writing, however, I realized I needed help. I needed more answers. Were we indeed soulmates? Had we lived many lifetimes together? Why did Saul have to leave me? How come I still had to do this work when he wasn't around anymore to help me? And where the hell could I go to get some answers? As if in response, my phone rang. It was my sister-in-law, Carolyn. Carolyn is a spiritual healer and teacher. When Saul was alive, he and I had believed that what she did was ridiculous. But I'd had a change of heart when Carolyn told me that just after the accident, she had received some messages from Saul. Just the other day, she was telling me, she'd picked up one of her books on spirituality and a piece of paper had fallen out of it. It was an ad from a local metaphysical center that had on it the name of certified psychologist Joan Pelham. One of her main services was spiritual grief counseling. I called her immediately for an appointment. I was greeted at the center by a beautiful blonde woman who turned out to be Joan Pelham herself. Even though I'd had success in contacting my husband through John Edward, I was still nervous about trying to reach Saulie again. It comforted me to learn that as a traditional psychologist, Joan had counseled families in hospitals, worked with children in public schools, and assisted police departments. She'd provided testimony and made mental health evaluations for the Superior Court of New Jersey. It was during this period, Joan explained, that she'd had an angelic experience and began receiving messages telepathically from the other side. I was thrilled to learn Saul had communicated with Joan the night before. In fact, she already had messages for me. The message above our bed says it all, he had told Joan. On the wall above our bed was a framed piece of pillow art of a man and woman walking down the aisle on their wedding day, very much in love. Another message was for me to go to our den, look at the third book from the left on the top shelf, and see what it was titled. The name of that book was Israel, My Beloved. Next, he had mentioned a scratch on the side of my kitchen sink, which he'd said needed to be repaired. I'd never noticed any scratch, but I looked closely when I got home, and there it was. Saul also told me to keep his side of our bed warm. There was no way Joan could have known I'd been sleeping on Saul's side of our bed. My dear husband really was communicating with me. Joan received messages from the other side via automatic writing. I would ask her a question, and she would write down whatever came to her on a pad of paper in front of her. It was very strange to watch, because when she was through writing, she would often have no recollection of what she'd just written. Joan even received answers to questions about a business deal she couldn't have known anything about. There was also detailed information about people she'd never met. But my favorite message was this: the most memorable moment of my life was when I looked into your eyes and said, "I love you. I remain forever in your heart and soul. We are merged as one. You are never alone, ever. Just trust that I guide you in every decision. No longer question what has occurred. Just know the last thing I thought of was you. I had no choice but to leave you. Now I will help you. Your hand I hold. My strength I give to you. I wait for you to glide gently into my open arms." After I stopped crying, I reminisced with Joan about the incredible love I'd shared with Saul. When I told her how sensual our sex life had been, she smiled shyly and said, "I know. Saul just put a visual into my head, but I'm embarrassed to share it with you. It's very explicit." With some prodding, Joan shared what she'd been shown. Saul had given her a graphically detailed description of our very last intimacy, savored in the hot tub at our ski house the night before he'd died. It was totally accurate. I left Joan that day excited and hungry for even more messages from Saul. I was missing him more than ever. I was becoming convinced the connection between Saul and me had to be a lot deeper than one lifetime. But Joan was not able to get information about past lives, so I asked Carolyn if she could recommend anyone who did past life work. She told me she'd had great respect for a woman named Lynn, from whom she'd once taken a class. That was endorsement enough for me. I called Leslie the very next morning. She had a very calm, soothing way about her. When I asked about past lives and the existence of soulmates, I was glad to see all her responses were based in common sense and solid family counseling theories. Leslie was definitely no wavy gravy spiritual medium. That, more than anything, gave me hope that maybe now I could get some real answers. I asked her to tell me a little of her own history. She was a family therapist, she said, as well as a spiritual educator, and went on to list some of the people who'd come to her for help. Former clients included rabbis, ministers, and doctors, psychologists, housewives, artists, and accountants. Earning a degree in family therapy, she said, had led her to spend 20 years counseling people in all stages of development and life struggles. What made her different from most of her peers, however, was that in her practice she also utilized her healing gifts. Apparently through these gifts, Leslie had been able to maintain direct communion with heaven for most of her life. Since the age of 3, she'd been communicating regularly with heaven. By maintaining this daily level of faith, and by constantly focusing on divine love, Leslie had developed a second sight that included being able to see people's souls while they were alive, as well as seeing the impacts of their actions on future generations. Because of this unique blend of healing abilities, heaven had guided her to create a sanctuary where souls on earth as well as in heaven could find resolution for how their actions affected the fabric of human existence. To facilitate her communication with all these souls in need, she had built a healing cabin on her land, which was sacred ceremonial ground for Native Americans in Massachusetts several hundred years ago. She intently wanted me to understand that channeling, or translating as she called it, was not what she normally did in her healing sessions. She explained that although some of her sessions could include guidance or simple messages from loved ones who had gone before, her main focus was healing soul wounds, helping people to embrace their soul wisdom and dealing with issues an individual suffered from during this lifetime. Just as I began to feel excited and trusting about this down-to-earth person, she threw me a curveball by telling me that, as we spoke, she was keenly aware of the essence of Saul's soul. If that weren't enough, she matter-of-factly stated that Saul needed me to help him. When I asked her what he could possibly need me to do for him up in heaven, she said all she could tell me right then was that she sensed a deep, pressing need in him to work through issues that were left over from our marriage. Do you mean to tell me he's hanging around up there in heaven with God and whoever, and he's spending his time thinking about what we should have done while we were married? Leslie laughed, assuring me his concerns were based on the soul level and had more to do with parts of himself he'd shut off from because of the pain he'd suffered while he was alive. She added that one of the problems with being soulmates, and yes, she reiterated as if she could hear my response, you were and are soulmates, is that sometimes the denial of one soul in the relationship can adversely affect the growth of the other. She said she wanted to get into more detail face to face. For the moment, the only other message coming from Saul was that he and I had a larger contribution, a joint soul purpose, she called it, that we would have made if the end of Saul's life hadn't been so hard and off track. At that point, she said, that I was free to do what I believed was right, but Saul's need felt very urgent. She recommended I come to her cabin as soon as possible, since my presence was apparently needed to complete this work, but ended by saying once again that I had to listen to my own wisdom and only come if I felt it would be the right thing to do. I have to admit that a lot of this stuff sounded pretty far-fetched. I was trying to be open-minded about this journey I had started on with John Edward, and I couldn't deny the comfort in Leslie's words. But she was a stranger living a simple life on a farm with her 4 kids. And there she was, sitting on that farm, having never laid eyes on me before, telling me Saul and I would be able to help each other heal and resolve issues between us from where he was. I weighed my skepticism against how genuine she really did sound. There was also the ringing endorsement my sister-in-law had given her. Looking back, I also have to admit there was a gut feeling urging me to go forward, but I just didn't know. Feeling vulnerable in my grief and wanting to let my skeptical nature lead the way, I knew I needed some reassurance. So I asked Leslie to let me think about it and call her back, and I immediately called Joan Pelham to ask her what she thought about this idea. She didn't know Leslie at all, but since I already trusted Joan, I told Saul through her that I would go to this healing cabin only if he truly believed it would help him. Joan lovingly encouraged me to go, telling me Saul had answered, "It will help both of us, so please go." I called Leslie back and arranged a time for the meeting that would change my life. 3 weeks later, I pulled into the dirt driveway of Leslie's farm in my brand-new, luxury edition Audi Quattro. Stepping out in Italian shoes and my favorite velour coveralls, my hair and nails just done, I couldn't help feeling that I was walking into a third-world country. I was a complete foreigner standing near the shabby farmhouse and staring out at the sheep-dotted pasture on either side of me. I figured I should walk up to the small, simple wooden cabin that stood alone in yet another field, since that was where Leslie had told me we'd be having the session. but the door was closed, and I wasn't sure what to do. So I nervously paced back and forth on a small patch of mowed grass close to the driveway's edge. I knew I was perfectly safe there on the warm, late fall day, but I kept looking over my shoulder anyway to make sure nothing was planning on springing out from behind some bush and attacking me. I just couldn't relax. I wanted to start. I wanted her to be the real thing, and the suspense was killing me. Finally, the cabin door opened, and there Leslie stood, a tall, dark-haired woman, simply dressed and barefoot. She said goodbye to the client just finishing a session. Then she smiled and waved at me to come on in. We introduced ourselves, and then she told me to sit down on a rough, hand-woven rug spread out in the center of the dusty floor. I complimented her on the beautiful pattern of the rug as I tried to get comfortable, and she told me she'd woven it herself with hand-dyed wool from the sheep on this farm. What she liked best was that it held the accumulated prayers for help, healing, and mercy of everyone who'd ever come to her cabin. She told me that one of her primary healing resources was the medicine way she had learned first from her Native American ancestors and later on her own. What she loved most about these teachings, she explained, was that they provided her with an ancient, long-standing knowledge that our souls live on after death. This way also had great respect for the fact that we can communicate with each other through the divide between heaven and earth. Keeping with that tradition, then, she wanted me to sit in the position of the North. According to the Native American medicine wheel, this is the direction from which we all receive wisdom and balance for healing. She waited a moment, but all I did was blink dumbly at her. I didn't have a clue which way north was. She smiled at my expression and pointed to her right. I shifted myself around and was about to ask her another question when she bowed on her knees in humble devotion before a simple altar, her palms stretched out in front of her, forehead to the floor. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to be doing, so I looked at another tapestry hanging on the wall to my left, breathing carefully in and out to try to relax. Suddenly, she sat up and, with eyes closed, began chanting loudly and with great enthusiasm. I'd never heard the songs she sang, but they were pretty, simple, and full of devotion. Her movements and chanting reminded me of the praying rabbis at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. When she'd finished, she moved toward me and carefully placed a hand on the top of my head. Throughout the session, she would gently explain to me what she was sensing in my body and soul that needed tending to as she worked on it. The first thing she saw in my heart was that there were some pieces of me that I needed to reclaim from Saul. Actually, I sense two things coming from your soul very strongly, Irene. The first is how incredibly deep your devotion to Saul runs in you. I can see about a half-dozen lifetimes in which you were together and very much in love. The second thing is you have an immense aching need to complete the work you came here to do this time around. It's interesting to me that, and she cut herself off in mid-sentence. Are you all right? I asked. I was lying on my back at that point, and her right hand rested on my solar plexus. Yes, sorry, I'm fine. But she still looked distracted to me. Where was I? You were saying something about the work I wanted to do here this time. Right, thank you. We'll get into that in a minute. First, there are some things I'd like to heal on the body level. I want to work on your right side, which is a real mess. Well, I started explaining. That's the side of me that took all the blows in the car accident. Would you mind telling me a little more about that? No, not at all. And I did, but for some reason it was hard to relive it all with her in that little cabin. It's hard to describe, but there's something about this kind of energy work that brings out or magnifies powerful memories or emotions. Needless to say, I started crying. It got so bad I had to sit up. She brought a tissue box closer to me and held my hand until the tears slowed. Don't worry, I'm used to this. She was able to do some more healing, but 2 more times she did that same thing where she stopped herself in mid-thought. Finally, she sat back on her heels, put her hands on her hips, and looked straight at me. He's here, you know. Saul? Oh, yes, he's right over there. She pointed to the far corner of the cabin. How do you see him? I mean, what? He's kind of like a hologram, clear and diffuse, yet the image is filled with the radiance of his soul. I had no idea what the hell she was talking about. He's wearing khaki pants, a cream-colored shirt with blue pinstripes, and blue-green loafers that must have been his favorites because they look really worn. I don't know how she knew it, but that was exactly what he had worn the last weekend we had been together. He's telling me how desperate he misses holding and touching you. He says he misses chocolate and worrying. He misses seeing and hugging his kids. All that sounded like Saul, but it could have been true of thousands of people. She went on. Now he's telling me that his memory of the sun on his skin and the breath in his lungs is enough to make him ache with unbelievable longing to be alive for even 1 more hour on earth. Leslie stopped and looked over at me. I think she was expecting me to be more skeptical, but the truth is my response to these messages was a lot like all the other times I'd tried contacting Saul since he had died. I waited for her to continue, but she just sat there. Leslie? I asked. Okay, she said, though not to me. Then she looked at me, tilted her head a little to one side, and said, I have to tell you something. Okay, I said, wondering what could possibly be going on now. I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this to you. Normally, my practice is limited to healing people. In the process of these sessions, I do sometimes hear from a client's loved one who's now on the other side. I've found over the years that most souls who go through all the trouble to push through the ether and my brain to talk to someone here on earth normally have a simple thought or concept they want to share. It's rare that they're interested in sitting around and having a full-out conversation. Also, when I say I hear them, what I mean is I take in the energy they are putting out at me and translate it into words that come as close as I can sense to what they might want to express. Am I making any sense? Oh, yes, I said. This was more information than I'd gotten from any of the others who channeled Saul for me. I was fascinated. And the only reason I'm willing to communicate with someone on the other side is to clean up patterns left undone from their death. Saul is here with us right now, and one of the things he needs to clean up is to apologize to you for withdrawing emotionally during the last few years of his life. She was right about that. Saul had withdrawn further into himself. It was one of the things that had made me worry so much about how hard life had been getting for him at the end. He's saying that he wants to... Wait a minute. I'm sorry, Irene. I don't know how else to say this except that your husband is one of the loudest, pushiest souls I've ever met. I laughed in full agreement. Normally I'm able to speak for the soul, Leslie went on. translating, as I said, in order to get the gist of what they want to say. But Saul is so clear and so loud, Irene. He's all but screaming at me to let him come through and have a conversation with you. I don't believe in that, and I almost never do it. In order to be that sort of channeler, you have to push your entire personality out of the way and literally give your body over to another soul so they can use you to talk. It's very uncomfortable, and I don't think it's a good thing for me or the person on the other side to do. But he will not let me work on you in peace, Irene. I'm not kidding. He's telling me I should trust him, that he desperately needs to talk to you without the restriction of my interpreting. He's just adamant. I can't get over this. Well, I'd love to talk to him, Leslie, but if you don't feel it's the right thing to do, then I don't want you to. I was lying, of course, but I knew it wouldn't be fair to get something for myself at her expense. She looked at me directly before smiling and saying, "Now you see, that's the reason right there that I might just have to trust him and let him come through. It's your integrity, Irene. You don't know how often, as a healer, I watch people come in here for help, but then they turn away from the things they have to do in order to get better. It's one of the hardest things about the work I do. I can help someone open more deeply to healing heaven love. I can awaken them to their soul purpose, and I can also get intuitive guidance about certain paths that might be best for someone to go down next. But the truth is, if that client is not willing to do whatever it takes to get better, to heal themselves of wounds either from this life or past ones, then all my caring, wisdom, and vision are for nothing. It's all wasted unless the client takes complete responsibility for his or her own life and healing process. Anything I or any psychic can give you by way of guidance is only potential. Everyone always has a choice. Not everyone I see chooses to take the help I'm offering. But there's something about you and this incredible energy I can feel in Saul's soul that makes me feel safe helping you too. You have a strength that goes so deep. I know you can handle the personal fallout that always happens whenever heaven comes through this forcefully. There's something very strong and true about the bond you two share. So I'm going to do as he asks. I'm going to relax and trust him. I'm going to let his personality access my brain and vocal cords so he can speak directly to you. I couldn't believe my ears. This was almost too much. I do have one provision, though, that I'm going to say out loud so you know it too, Irene. I'll allow Saul to come through me, but I refuse to lose consciousness during the conversation. That's just too uncomfortable for me. So I'm going to let him in, Irene. It'll still be my voice that you hear, but he'll be using I statements that refer to him, obviously, and you'll probably start to recognize the flavor of his personality as it comes through. Are you ready? I nodded cautiously. Are you sure this won't be too unsettling for you? No, don't worry. In fact, I'm happy to do it if it'll shut him up. Then she sat quietly for a moment, her eyes closed. She opened them and looked straight at me again. You want proof that it's me, don't you, Irene? I didn't respond. First of all, I want you to know how glad I am to see you. I know Leslie started talking to you on the phone about our joint soul purpose, and I've got more to tell you about that. But when I got up here in heaven and found out I need you to help me finish my work, boy, I was sweating bullets. Why? I asked, almost in spite of myself. Because I was terrified you wouldn't have the chutzpah to believe me and make yourself such a public figure by writing a book, And all those people who've been telling you you're going to write a book are right, by the way. That's one of the ways we're going to get our message out. But Christ, Irene, all I had to pin my hopes on about your doing the right thing was how much you trusted and loved me. I don't mean that the way it came out. That's a huge thing to rely on. But I'm up here and you're down there, for Christ's sake. And you know how we didn't believe in this life after death crap when I was alive. And now look at me. I've got to beg this woman for 5 minutes with you, and we can't even be alone. And look at her, Irene. She's nothing like the company we used to keep. We wouldn't have been caught dead taking a nut like this seriously back then. And get this one. Normally, Leslie wouldn't have anything to do with the likes of us either. Well, let me tell you, Heaven's having a good laugh on all three of us now, because I need her, I need you to believe in her, and she needs to complete her sole purpose by helping us. If this wasn't my Saulie, this soul sure had the same straight-talking approach to life my husband had had. Everyone in heaven knew we'd be all right, though. They'd all seen the way you loved me, and they knew that meant you knew me inside and out. With that kind of knowledge, they were convinced you'd be able to recognize my true essence anywhere and in any form. Well, do you recognize me? Part of me was so sure it was Saul, I found myself fighting back the desire to reach out and try to touch him. Of course, if I could have, the first thing I would have done was kiss him. Right after that, though, I would have punched him right in the head for leaving me the way he had. But I still wanted more proof, and I told him so. You got it, Irene. How would you feel if I told you everyone in heaven is rooting for you to get your sole purpose done, because they all know what a pain in the ass you can be when you're frustrated by not having completed it? You know what heart palpitations you gave the caterer, the florist, and the musicians whenever you threw a party? Well, that's the same way you get up here in heaven when you're determined. If you don't finish your sole purpose before you cross over, when you arrive in that mood, everyone up here is going to run to hell to get away from you. This was getting harder and harder not to believe. Someone might be able to know something about Saul or our history, but to make a personal joke about me the same way he had when he was alive was really hitting close to home. Told you, he said confidently. Now listen up, cuz, because I have a lot of stuff to tell you, and I don't know how long Leslie's good for. There it was again. Cuz was Saul's nickname for me, and Leslie couldn't possibly have known that. I could feel myself getting more and more excited. Poor Leslie. Saul talked non-stop for almost an hour about our joint soul purpose, about our past lives and how heaven works, the whole bit. He interspersed his monologue with enough details from our life together, like how we had first kissed and the meals I'd made that he'd loved the most, that I didn't need any more proof. I can't begin to express how rewarding it was to talk with my beloved Saul again, and finally to get some of my questions answered. He explained that heaven wanted the book to be about our lives so people can have a model of living love as a behavior. In this way, the Creator and our angels hoped the changes people might adopt from our story would carry on into their daily lives, not only throughout this lifetime, but on into generations to come. The other piece of the puzzle he gave me was the picture of what our life together should have been if Saul hadn't needed to die. Originally, we were supposed to have had a slow spiritual awakening and an awareness of our joint soul purpose, to remain this model of a healthy family that lived love as a daily behavior, much later in life. Because Saul had become too wounded in his soul to stay open to this, heaven had taken him early. Now, from the safety of heaven, as Saul's soul was healing, he had awakened to our purpose. Through my devotion to him, I was being led to an awakening of my own. To my genuine amazement, this information did not surprise me in the least. Somehow, it all felt really right to me. But now that we're stuck with the situation as it is, cuz, I need to talk seriously about you, Irene. You need to activate yourself, to get in touch with your own knowing. I can't stress this enough. You have got to do your soul purpose now before you have to leave like I did. Because the truth is, once you cross over, you no longer have the tools you need to get your soul purpose done. You can't imagine the pain that causes in your soul. Well, Saul, you've talked about our joint soul purpose, but are you telling me there's something else I'm supposed to do on my own? Yes and no. It's not like there are two separate things you have to do, but there are things in your life that need some attention. I know you're grieving now, but you aren't going to be feeling this bad forever, Irene. And when you feel stronger, you've got to take the desire to get the message out that love matters and goes on no matter what, and open your heart to someone new. Are you saying it's my sole purpose to find another man? No, cuz, but it is going to happen. You are going to love again, and I, for one, can't wait to see you being loved and cared for. He may not be your soulmate, because I ain't giving that job up for anybody, but he will be kind and loving and all the things you need. You've got quite a few years to go before you're done this time around, Irene. I don't want you to be alone. But when I talk about what's personal to you, I mean you need to be a model for people on your own the same way our marriage was supposed to be, and was for some people. When you agreed to my having that emergency exit, you knew I'd find a way to find you from the other side, and you knew you'd need that contact in order to be reminded about love and how it strengthens you. That way you'd be able to finish the work you came here to do. And part of that work includes keeping the bridge between heaven and earth alive in order to give people hope and faith to go on no matter what painful stuff they face. That's what you do, Irene. That's who you are to the core. Do you understand what I'm saying here? I think so. I'm going to need to think about it some more, though. Well, of course you are. We've covered a lot of territory here today. I know, but while we're on the subject, I just want to know how people can know what their sole purpose is. I mean, I have you and Leslie here helping me out. How can others get that information? Part of the reason healers like Leslie are working on the planet right now is so they can be resources for anyone looking for this kind of wisdom. But of course, the answer is inside everyone. Let me use you as an example. Ask yourself, what has been the thing that you have been the most curious about your whole life, regardless of your anger, grief, or whatever? I guess that I care about how people get along. I always want to know how each of us is supposed to survive the psychic and emotional pain of living. But how is that a sole purpose? Hang on. The next thing you do is think about where in your life you feel the most empty. Ask yourself, what is your greatest dissatisfaction? That's easy. Feeling ineffectual and invisible in the presence of others. Good. Now put those two together, Irene, and ask yourself, what can you do about it? Instead of complaining, try to come up with a practical behavior you can do to make whatever it is you've thought of easier for you and for others. Use those two extremes in your life and think about them carefully. Keep breathing and being silent whenever you can, and the answer will come to you. It will. And when it does, it'll be so clear it'll seem obvious, like you can't understand why you didn't think of it a long time ago. Our time was pretty much done for that session. Leslie was worn out, and she still had to get supper for her kids. But we were all three excited about what had happened. Over the next several months, Saul, through Leslie, would tell me about past lives we had shared, as well as bring me astonishing information about the journey he'd taken since he'd left me that cold winter day. These sessions brought me great joy. They also helped me adjust to my new life alone. Here's how it all began.